And here we are again, and we're going to be doing the second half, the second of our two recordings about the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, and the ratification process. In our last one, we talked about the reason that the Constitutional Convention comes into existence, some of the motivations behind that, things like Shays' Rebellion, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, and then talked about some of the central debates and discussions and disagreements that need to be hammered out as the convention proceeds during the spring of 1787 in Philadelphia. And so we talked a little bit about this idea that the delegates were hoping to separate the government, at least to a certain degree, separate the government away from the average person. There is also a realization that too much power, or an argument that too much power in the hands of any part of the government could potentially create a despotism. The founders were hypersensitive or hyper concerned about the possibility that the country would be plunged back into a situation similar to that they escaped from during the American Revolution. The worry that sort of the absolute power corrupts absolutely kind of idea, that if any one part of the government got too powerful, that would ultimately result in an erosion of the individual liberties and freedoms that the revolution was fought to secure. And so they implement, at least in theory and in structure, two different ideas to try to water down the power of any part of the governmental system. One of those is the concept of separation of powers. Now, separation of powers happens at the national level, but it also happens at the state level, it happens at the local level. This is the idea that you have three branches of government. You have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And at the national level, the executive branch would be the president, and then all of the different agencies that are part of the executive branch. So that would be the IRS and Social Security, and the National Park Service, and the EPA, what there is left of it, and the CDC, what there is left of it, and so on and so forth, right? So the executive branch now contains all of those things. The legislative branch is primarily Congress. There are a couple of other sort of extended parts to that, things like the Office of Management and Budget, the Congressional Budget Office, things like that, and the judicial branch, which most famously is the Supreme Court, but includes district courts and courts of appeals and things like that. Now, the idea of separation of powers affects other levels of government as well, right? Because at the state level, power is separated across the governor, who is the executive. In our case, in Ohio, it's called the General Assembly, which is the legislative branch. And Ohio has a court system, including an Ohio Supreme Court, right? At the local level, you have the mayor, you have city council, you have city courts. So separation of powers happens at all the different levels of government. Those different levels of government constitute what's known as federalism. Federalism is the idea that some powers will only exist in the hands of the national government. Most obvious would be things like the power to declare war, right? Specifically speaking, that is the responsibility of Congress. Only Congress has the power to technically declare war. The United States has gotten involved in a lot of military conflicts over the last 60 years that have not been declarations of war, but have resulted in tens of thousands of people dying. Those are not exactly the same thing. Only Congress can declare war. So if Ohio gets pissed off with Canada, Ohio can't just say, okay, Canada, we're going to war. Only Congress can make that determination. Issuing money. That's another thing that is an example of a division of the powers of government that's based on federalism, right? Only the national government can print money. So it's not like you travel to Iowa and all of a sudden there are Iowa dollars and Iowa coins. There are things that are only the responsibility of states. Chartering banks, which I know is a really sexy thing to talk about, but only states have the power to charter banks. Whoop-de-doo. There are some then that are sort of concurrent, right? For instance, setting speeds on interstate highways. The federal government says, okay, these are the guidelines that you have to follow. Within that, the state can make determinations about what the speed limit is on interstate highways within the boundaries of their state. So federalism is the separation or the division of different powers and responsibilities between the national government, the state governments, and the local governments. Separation of powers is separating sort of horizontally, right? Within each of those layers, you have the judicial system, the executive branch, the legislative branch, all designed to limit and restrict the possibility of factions gaining too much power or any one part of the government gaining too much power. There's questions, certainly, how effective separation of powers or federalism actually are. Those are a conversation for a different setting, though. Part of the idea behind federalism and the separation of powers goes back to this concern with the dangers of democracy as well. There is still that worry that too much democracy is actually a bad thing. And this is going to be a driving concept behind a lot of American politics, really all the way up into the 1830s, 1820s and 1830s. And we'll return to that when we talk about the Jackson period in a different section. When we talked about representation, some of you might have had in the back of your mind, okay, so states were getting representatives based on the number of people that live in their state. What about states that have large numbers of enslaved people? And that's actually a very good question. Go and give yourself a candy bar, because that's actually one of the main concerns that delegates at the convention had, because there were states, places like South Carolina, for instance, that actually had more enslaved people than free people. So naturally, places like South Carolina would like all of the people living in their state to be counted as part of their population, because that would give them higher numbers of representatives. Northern states, on the other hand, even though the vast majority of them still allowed slavery, northern states typically have far fewer numbers of enslaved people, and so wouldn't benefit very much at all from having slaves count as part of their state's population. Excuse me. So northern states say, no, we're not going to allow you to count enslaved people as part of your population. A, it would give you an inflated number of representatives in Congress. It would give you an inflated number of electoral votes, because the number of electoral votes that a state gets is equal to the number of senators and representatives that that state has. And so it would give those southern states a kind of, I don't want to say unfair advantage, but an advantage that isn't reflective in what those numbers actually mean. And what I mean by that is, southern states, they make the case that slavery as an institution is the bedrock of their economy. And the money and the revenue that states like the Carolinas or Virginia pump into the national economy is really dependent upon slavery. And they say that economic involvement, that economic value, is what we contribute to powering the country. And as a result, we deserve to have our slaves counted as part of our population. And the North says that's absurd. They say the enslaved people will not have the benefit of a vote at all, right? These are people who would be counted in other ways as nothing more than a farm animal. To be, yeah, I mean, it's ugly to think about, but that's essentially what an enslaved person's legal status would be. You're not allowing horses or mules to vote. Legally speaking, you consider enslaved people to be basically equal to that. If you're not giving the enslaved person a vote, they shouldn't get counted in the number of people living in your state. Well, here again, this threatens to potentially break apart the Constitutional Convention, because southern states dig in their heels and they say, we will get enslaved people counted as part of our representation. Northern states dig in their heels and they say, no, you certainly won't. But both sides say, you know what? We can't let the United States break apart just a few years after it gets going. And so they come to an agreement that says each enslaved person will count as 3/5 of a person for the basis of population and representation. So basically what that means is 60% of a state's slave population will be sort of factored into the calculation to determine how many representatives that state gets. In addition, part of the 3/5 compromise says the federal government will not interfere in the international slave trade for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. Many people from the North were personally anti-slavery. Actually, some people from southern states were personally anti-slavery. But there was not a very significant abolition movement. In other words, there wasn't a very significant movement to actually destroy slavery. There were societies scattered throughout northern cities like Philadelphia or Boston or New York that sort of advocated for the destruction of slavery, but it wasn't a very popular movement, and it wasn't a very popular idea. More often than not, the belief was, well, maybe we can just kind of set certain conditions in place that will ultimately lead to slavery just sort of dying over time. This was the idea of people like Thomas Jefferson. It ended up not being viable because whether it was viable to begin with or not is one question. Historically speaking, circumstances change in ways that mean that the only way that slavery ends up being gotten rid of once and for all is as a result of the Civil War. So a pretty monumental kind of trauma is necessary to ultimately eliminate slavery from the country. But with slavery being sorted constitutionally, that's really the other major debate that the delegates have at the time. And so they agree to the Constitution as it's written in September of 1787. But from that point, the real challenge happens, which is convincing the states to ratify the Constitution, to agree to the Constitution. Technically speaking, 9 states have to ratify it, but everybody recognizes that ultimately it needs to be unanimous, right? You can't really have a country with 9 states, but other states not being part of that government. And so the debate begins pretty quickly over whether or not each state is going to ratify. And they come up with a lot of different points of concern, agreement, disagreement. Some states ratify fairly quickly, states like Delaware, which is the first one to ratify the Constitution. The first several states jump on board within the first couple months, so it doesn't take long. As it gets closer and closer and closer to that 9th state, the momentum really starts to slow down. And so it starts to become harder and harder and harder to get those last few states to ratify the Constitution. There are a number of fairly prominent figures that say, well, the Constitution is the tool of the wealthy and it's only going to support rich people. There are some that say the president is too powerful, according to the powers outlined in the Constitution. He's going to be a danger to the government and a danger to the people. There are some, and this is a much more common kind of a concern, that say there's nothing in this document that protects the individual person. If you've ever read the Constitution, you'll notice that by and large, the document really is a pretty dry, legal kind of a thing that says, here's how the government will operate. And so you start to see these two opposing camps emerge. On the one hand, you have the Federalists, and the Federalists have some of the biggest heavy hitters in America at the time, people like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison. On the other hand, you have the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists are the people who are opposing the ratification of the Constitution. And they're not all opposed because of the same things. Some of them are worried about the Constitution's lack of guarantees of individual liberties. Other people are concerned with the power of the presidency. Some people are concerned with A and B. Other people with B and C. But ultimately, as it starts to get closer and closer to that number 9, the two most powerful states in the United States, Virginia and New York, have not ratified. They have not signed off. Excuse me. And so the some of the most prominent figures that sort of make up the Federalists decide that they're going to write some essays to try to encourage ratification. Now, they're specifically trying to encourage their home state, well, not all of their home states, the state of New York, which is the home state of John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, but is not the home state of James Madison. They want to try to convince New York to ratify, because they believe if New York ratifies, that will be the domino that will push all the others down. So they write a series of 85 different essays, the Federalist Papers, that address all kinds of different arguments against the Constitution. And some of these Federalist Papers are hugely influential parts of American political theory. And ultimately, partially because of the Federalist Papers, but partially because of another particular agreement or compromise, New York ratifies and other states do as well. So the Federalist Papers, compiled, initially printed in a newspaper in New York City, quickly they're compiled into books and pamphlets to be distributed over more parts of the country. Certainly influential in the process of getting the last of those states to cross the finish line. But also important was the fact that there were a lot of anti-federalists that said there needs to be some kind of promise that the government that we are setting up right now will protect those individual freedoms that we were trying to secure during the Revolution. And some Federalists, including James Madison, are saying, we don't want to put a Bill of Rights like that into the Constitution, because as soon as we do, anything that's not specifically listed in that Bill of Rights could be treated as a not guaranteed right. Okay? So in other words, there is nothing in the Bill of Rights anywhere that says that you have the right, excuse me, that you have the right to sleep in until noon every day. That's not anywhere indicated in the Bill of Rights. Obviously, this is a farcical kind of an example, but it gives the idea. And so, because that is not specifically listed as a right, the government doesn't have any responsibility or requirement or obligation to ensure that you have that right as a citizen of the United States. And people like Madison say, well, the government itself is the guarantee of the rights. And the anti-federalists say, but there's nothing that stops the government from violating those rights unless those rights are enumerated in very clear language. And so, somewhat grudgingly, although they kind of changed their mind and are a little bit more supportive of the idea later, Federalists agree to craft a Bill of Rights and tack it onto the Constitution. That will be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And with that, that also helps grease the wheels a little bit to convince other states to ratify. And so the Constitution officially goes into effect in June of 1788, when New Hampshire ratifies. The last state, and even then it's by a hair's breadth, the last state to ratify is Rhode Island. Interestingly, Rhode Island didn't even send delegates to the convention in the first place. They were so concerned with losing their state's rights. So the government that the Constitution creates goes into effect in April of 1789 with the election, the unanimous election of George Washington as president. The Bill of Rights is written and finalized and added to the Constitution in November of 1789. And then Rhode Island is the last of the 13 states to join, the last of the original 13 states to join, and that is in May of 1790. And so that establishes the Constitution as the framework that the government is built upon all the way through down to the present. Obviously, it's then amended and sort of tweaked here and there over time. Things like granting women the right to vote, ending slavery, and expanding civil rights for African Americans, those kinds of things. But the core system is largely unchanged from the way the Constitution created it in 1787, 8, and 9. So that is the end of the Constitution material. Let me know if you've got questions about any of that. Our next actual content will jump ahead a little bit because it is moving into the early 1800s. So in the meantime, make sure that you're staying on top of the full PowerPoints and the other course materials that are available on Blackboard. And so I will see everybody next time when we talk about the Jackson period, which is going to introduce some pretty significant changes to American society, and American politics going forward. So that's going to be an important transition point as we move closer and closer to the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, and closer to the Civil War. So I hope you're all doing really, really well. Let me know if you've got questions about anything, and I will catch you on the flip side.